Good evening. Welcome you to our Proverbs class. If you are visiting with us, my name is Charles Plemons, and we are trying to finish up a study on Proverbs. And we are almost done with section 9. We'll get through that here in just a few moments. On the board, we've got a note here. It's back to school time. I know for some people that's a great celebratory time. For others, it's a time of much anguish and disdain. But, whichever side of the fence you're on, it is that time. And so we might need to go back to school ourselves as the parents, grandparents, whatever. I found this really neat Bible reading plan generator online, and so it's up here. And what I like about it is you can pick different sections, different books, different topics, and tell it kind of a timeline that you want to do it in, and it'll even break things down and put it directly onto your calendar if you want. You can print it out. All kinds of neat things that this will do. So if you were looking for an opportunity to do a reading or a study, or you're trying to find something to keep you a little more organized, here's something that may be helpful to you. So just wanted to point that out. A little review from last week. We were talking about the idea of anger and the idea of controlled anger. And fortunately, we had this wonderful devotional just a few minutes ago on anger. So we were looking at ideas of God's anger and the difference between the anger that God has and the anger that man has. And so for review, we remember that anger itself is not sinful. If it were sinful, God couldn't get angry. But we know God does get angry. God shows his wrath. So anger is not a sin. So God gives us examples of righteous anger. And we learned that anger can actually be a motivator. It can be something that fuels our passion to accomplish things that need to happen. But so often we end up using our anger in the wrong manner. And so last week we had gone through, and let's see, I think I skipped, let's go back one. Here we go. So we had just gotten to this chart here. So this is comparing God's anger and man's anger. And so you can compare these two different things. We see with man's anger, it's often uncontrolled. It's impulsive. We have this no real purpose, no real logic for it. It's something that causes us to act in a uncontrolled manner. It's often fueled by hate or malice or resentment. It's usually selfish. It can be an expression of indignation. It's often used to destroy things or an individual. It's an expression of revenge. We see man's anger breaking relationships. We see it at violations to self. So what I mean by that is if something happens to us, then we are reacting to that. And then also at those who cross me, those who make me mad. This idea that I'm going to get back at you. You did this to me, so you're going to suffer for it. God's anger, however, by contrast, we see it's controlled. It has a purpose. He has a reason behind it. There's something that's going to come positive overall, either for the person that is involved in this or for society as a whole, God's people as a whole. It's not done with hate or malice or resentment. God does not have hate within him for us. He hates sin. We've talked about that repeatedly. But God does not react with hate toward us. It's not selfish. It's an expression of concern, either for us or for his people. It corrects destructive behavior. It's an expression of care. And it's not designed to break relationships, although oftentimes someone being mad at you or wrathful at you can break relationships. How many times do we see God doing things that, for example, you look at the Israelites, they have provoked God's anger and he does something, but the point of it is to restore that relationship, not to break it apart. The relationship's already damaged because of the choices of the Israelites. It's at injustice or at willful disobedience. How many times do we see God get angry at those who just choose to do the wrong things and repeatedly choose to do the wrong things. So just a little chart for you comparing and contrasting the two. All right, so catching up to where we were last week now. So let's talk about the value of a controlled person. Proverbs is going to teach us, if we turn to verse 16:32, that the person who learns self-control is a valuable person. They have worth. Proverbs 16:32 says, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." So the person who is slow to anger, the controlled person, we have a comparison here. Who are they compared against, who we often see as someone who would have value in society? What kind of person is being described here? It says, slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than those who take a city. Like a warrior, yeah, or like a soldier, it's a military kind of thing. So what we see here is an example of a hero, perhaps. Don't we often talk about heroes? We erect statues to those who have great military accomplishments. So that would be somebody who in society has great value. And so he's saying the person who is slow to anger is even better than what you would consider a hero. That's high praise. That's high praise. So historically, we've seen people exalt military heroes, and we have an example over in 1 Samuel 18, verse 7. And this is a very famous, you'll hear this quoted quite a bit. 1 Samuel 18:7, it's comparing Saul and David. It says, "So the women sang as they danced and said, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. So we have this example of a military hero. So even a military hero is not as great, God says, as the person who does something as simple as control their own anger. But that should also give us an idea of, one, how important this is. God has exalted the person who can control their anger, but it should also give us an idea of how difficult that is. How many military heroes are there? Well, over the span of all of human history, a lot, but at any one time, not everybody's a military hero. It takes a lot to become that. And God is saying, this person, the control person, is better even than that. It's not an easy achievement. We can surmise that. It takes true effort to achieve that. So it says, the man who has conquered his own spirit is greater than the person who can capture a city. And someone who has fought to capture a city, they fought a great battle. But how great of a battle is it to conquer your own anger, your own spirit, your own impulses? That's a greater battle. I think we can surmise that from this bit of scripture. The value of the controlled person from a spiritual standpoint, God is saying is very high. And we got so close. This was the last slide. We got so close to finishing last week. So here's the conclusion slide of section 9. So we know that we have people that are raised in our society that they come up in an environment where there's little effort to control temper. So we have people that have learned abusive language, violence. They've been taught this from a young age. But even though they've been taught this, that doesn't mean that it's really the acceptable way to live. You know, God is teaching us a better way. There's so many things that shape us into who we are, and the world is a very good way, or has a good way of shaping us into the wrong things. God is telling us there is a better way. So sometimes we see people raised in environments where anger is suppressed to the point where we say this person doesn't have a spine, they don't have a backbone, or they compromise too much. They yield too much. They avoid conflict. I think if you look at our society, avoiding conflict is something that we have really embraced. We do it virtually. We're great at arguing online, but people don't want to actually have those hard conversations with each other. They'll do it remotely, but we've taught ourselves to avoid these confrontations. So sometimes we need anger to motivate us to have the right kinds of conversations. So our society sometimes shapes us into people who have the wrong type of anger, but it also can shape us into the people who avoid the right type of anger or passion, if you will. So we need to strive as Christians to use anger in the way that God and Jesus demonstrate to us, as opposed to the ways that the devil would have us do it. We should go back to that chart that we showed a few minutes ago and look under the God column. If we're going to be angry, and we're going to use anger appropriately, we need to be looking, how can we check off those boxes? Not the ones that are our knee-jerk reaction, not the ones that so often come from man's anger. Any thoughts or comments now on anger? And I know we're moving quickly. We're trying to get through as much content as we can. All right. Well, let's move on to section 10 then. And I have handouts for section 10 if anybody needs them. Is anybody in need of a section 10? One or two? You're welcome. Thank you. All right, so Andy's coming around with those. Thank you, sir. So let's now talk about the sin of pride. Proverbs has a whole lot to say about pride. And we have to think about pride and remember that it is often considered one of the 7 deadly sins. Now, that's kind of a dangerous term in my mind. I think we sometimes focus on this idea of, the 7 deadly sins, or we have a tendency in society to rank sins. We say, this is a worse thing to do than this other thing. But from God's perspective, sin is sin. The wages of sin is death. Which sin? Sin. All of them. Any of them. Anything that we do is a deadly sin. But society has lumped in pride as one of these that we highlight as being one of the 7 deadly ones. So Webster defines to us pride as being these things. So number 1 is an over-high opinion of oneself, exaggerated self-esteem or conceit. So thinking too highly of yourself. It also says the showing of this in behavior, haughtiness or arrogance. And you see these things going hand in hand. If you think too highly of yourself, how are you likely to behave around other people? And then it tells us it's a sense of one's own dignity, of worth, or self-respect. So, number 3 is not a bad thing. We can have pride in the sense of dignity. We can have pride in the sense of self-respect. We can be proud to be Christians. It's not a sin to be proud to be a Christian. It's not a sin to be proud of the accomplishments of the church. It's not a sin to be proud of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. We, in English, which is a fun language, we have 2 opposite meanings here of pride. You have a very negative and a very positive. So we're talking about the negative side of things. So please don't take away from this. If somebody says that, well, I'm proud of something. Oh, no. You got to look at it in the context. What do they mean? What are they really saying when they say that they are proud? So we should possess a sense of self-respect. Our own pride should want us to be better people. It should want us to have a good place in society. It should want us to stand up and be the representative of Christ that he would want us to be, that kind of pride, that being proud in that manner is a good thing. But it's always on the edge. We have to be careful, though, that we don't start thinking too highly of ourselves. When we are looking at our self-respect, some of that we have to think about, where does that come from? Am I proud of who I am because of what God has done for me? Or am I proud of who I am because of the things that I think I've done for myself? Huge difference. And so there's a Chinese proverb. It says, "He who stands on a pedestal has nowhere to step but off." So let's talk about pride as sin. So, going back to this idea of number one, this over high opinion of ourselves. When we develop an exaggerated or overly high opinion of ourselves, or our thoughts, or the way that we do things, that's sin. And Proverbs talks to us. It says in Proverbs 21, verse 4. Proverbs 21:4, it says, "A haughty look, a proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked are sin." So that pride in the heart, that haughty look, that arrogance, those are sin. Now, pride can be something that we do and are engaged in as individuals, but it can also be something that can affect an entire society or even a generation. And we see that in Proverbs. Proverbs calls this out. So God sometimes marks a generation as being one that is irreverent to God and being too haughty or too arrogant. And we see that in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 13, rather. Proverbs 30:13. Says, "There is a generation, oh, how lofty are their eyes, and their eyelids are lifted up." So he's describing a whole generation of people, a whole group in society as being prideful, lofty. Well, this didn't end here in Proverbs. Let's turn over to Romans chapter 1. Many, many, many years later, we still see this kind of thing. Romans 1, verse 30, it says, "Backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents." Proud people didn't disappear between when Proverbs was written and when Romans was written. We still see that going on in society. So we have a whole generation, a whole society that is too proud. What might God say about our society today? How do we feel about ourselves in general? I saw several people shaking their head or scrunching up their faces. This is a warning for us. God looks at entire generations. He looks at societies, and he sometimes finds them wanting. Our challenge is to live in a society that apparently several of us think may be a little too proud, just judging by the facial expressions I just got. How do we have a positive impact to curb that? How do we get people to lower their eyes, this haughty look, if your eyes are lifted up, you're looking down your nose, you got your nose up in the air. How do we get people to get that nose back down and behave in the appropriate manner? That's the society we live in, this arrogant society. God warns us about these. Well, part of that we have to understand how it's come about. Where does this come from? Well, God tells us. He gives us an example here. Since you were in Romans, turn over to Mark right quick. Mark chapter 7, 21 through 23. Mark 7, 21 through 23. And what we're going to see is sometimes these ideas, they come from a corrupted heart, or they stem from a corrupted heart. Mark 7, 21 through 23 says, "For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a man. So God's telling us a corrupted heart can lead to this. If we have a whole society full of people with corrupted hearts, what can we expect to find in that society? Well, pride was in the list. Let's read that list again. Evil thoughts. Do we ever see that in society today? Sure. Adulteries, fornications, murders. How about somebody just hold your hand up when we get to one that we never see? Thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. So how did we get here? Well, I heard it. Absence of God. Yeah, all of this is the opposite of God. So our society has a God problem, or a godless problem. We see the result of that corrupt heart, the heart that's not guided by God. We see all these things happening, pride being one of them. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, they're exact polar opposites, if you will. Yeah. So the reason I bring this up with the concept of pride is because I think pride really has a key to this whole conversation of how we got here. Many people, if you don't have God, you've put yourself before God. You've put your own ways before God. You've allowed that pride to take over your life. My way is better. What I want to do goes. What I say goes. My opinion is pride is an underpinning to all of these different problems we see in society, because we see these societies or see these problems because people have abandoned God. Pride is at the root of a whole lot of that. So when we talk about a deadly sin, look at what pride has done to all of us. We're all dealing with the impact of that. You may not be involved in any of these things we just listed, but you're affected by these things. These things go on around us. These things happen to us. These things happen to people we care about. All of this has an impact. Yeah, absolutely. Society didn't get here on its own. It's all the individuals have led us here. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Absolutely. Right. Right. You know, you hear this question in terms of all kinds of different things of, well, what does it hurt? What does it harm? Well, if it's against God's will, there's the harm. It's leading people away from God. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So pride is a serious concern for us, and it has major impact. Now, let's look at how pride works. We see pride as temptation. Pride gives the devil an avenue to drag us into sin. He has a way to tempt us into sin through pride. So, John, when he writes, we're going to turn over to 1 John for a moment. A lot of New Testament for a study of Proverbs, isn't it? John describes for us that when Satan does his work, he uses words like vainglory and pride of life in the description. 1 John chapter 2, verse 15. And so here, I think I've quoted the wrong verse there. It says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him." Well, that didn't have what I thought it did it? Next verse. Would you read that for me?
For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world.
Thank you. I'm going to blame my computer for that. No, that was on me. So, 1 John 2:16, not 15. Mark that out. Put 16. The pride of life. All these things that tempt us. We look around and we want to have status. We want to have station. We want to have all these things. You have people that are tempted into sin because, I want to feel like I'm the best looking person here, or the best acting person here, or the person who has the best skill at this or that or the other. I have the best house. I have the best yard. I have, whatever that is a physical, tangible thing. Now, I'm not saying, please, those of you who are immaculate gardeners and stuff, don't think I'm saying if you've got a good yard, your pride has got you. That's not what I'm saying. But we do see people that so often look into the world and pride. I want to be the best. I want to have that. I want to be recognized as this. We lift ourselves up when we are falling into temptation due to our pride. It's an avenue that he allows us to be tempted, or he uses to tempt us. So we see things like our appearance, education. I'm going to have the highest degree. I'm going to be, the person who has the most letters after my name when I sign my name. Race or social standing. How many people have been tempted into sin because they're trying to achieve a better social status because of their pride? Their job. I would never do that job. I would never do this. I would never do that. I'm going to be the person who does X, Y, or Z. Newsflash, folks. Every job that you see out there being done that helps society run is a necessary job. We're all in this together. Society doesn't work without people doing everything from what we call the glamorous jobs to the not so glamorous jobs. Without people doing those not so glamorous jobs, everybody else suffers. Let's not get too puffed up about the job that we do. Are you contributing positively to society? Thank you. Possessions. Prideful in our possessions. I'm going to have the best jewelry. I'm going to have the best clothes. I'm going to have the best car. I'm going to have yada, yada, yada. Now, I'm not talking from a greed standpoint. Greed is related to this. I'm just talking about that appearance, that pride standpoint. Now, let's turn over to Proverbs 30, 7 through 9. Proverbs 30, 7 through 9. It says, 2 things I request of you. Deprive me not before I die. Remove falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food allotted to me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. What an interesting verse. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Why? What did that just tell us? I heard you whisper it over there. If you got too much, then you might turn away from God. If you have too little, you might fall into sin. This is an interesting lesson from Proverbs right here telling us, he's saying, Lord, did you give me just enough? Give me what I need. Give me enough to where I don't get all puffed up about it, but also that I don't fall into sin trying to acquire it. Lord, just take care of me, is what it's asking for. What an interesting verse. How many times do we see people that, I do anything for wealth, or they're praying, I need money, somebody pray for me. That's kind of the concept, right? I'm going to pray for wealth. That's not what we're being taught here. Lord, sustain me, is what we see right here. Interesting verse. All right, any thoughts on any of that so far? Yeah, and it's nothing in relation to the Lord for some different reasons. One, we have the temporary nature of it. So whatever you glory in is going to pass away. Yeah. 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 Strength will fail. Wisdom will fail. Your riches will run out, or that old saying, you can't take it with you. All of these are very temporary, temporal things. But your relationship with God, folks, your relationship with God is permanent. It doesn't end. You can take that with you. You do take that with you. Yes, sir. Right. Absolutely. I like that. If you're sowing yourself, you'll reap yourself. And what are we? But nothing. Absolutely. Great verses. Great verses. All right, so let's look now at some of the things that pride does. So if you'll remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the idea of lazy fruit, right? Cultivating lazy fruit. Well, we're back to our garden now because we can also cultivate pride fruit. We want to remember that when God listed the things that he despises or the things that he hates, one of the things he listed was pride. So we're going to just review for a moment. Proverbs 6:17 is where we see that listed. And we're not reading the whole verse, just that whole section, just Proverbs 6:17. It says, a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood. So this is one of the things that God said he hates. He finds it abhorrent. It's an abomination to him. So pride, we have to realize, dethrones God in our hearts. Now, it's very important that you add that in our hearts to that statement. Our pride doesn't truly dethrone God. We can't dethrone God. But in our heart, in our relationship, in our attitude toward God, our pride knocks him off the throne. Who does it put on the throne? Us. It puts us first, but only in our hearts and only in our minds. Who here has sat on the throne of God? None. We've never budged God from the throne, but we may have in our minds, in our make-believe, in our temporary worldly sense, said, well, I'm going to be the ruler. I'm going to be king. I'm going to make the rules. I'm going to make the laws. Turn back to Romans. Well, no, we just read this one, Romans 1:3. This is just a rehash. Paul was describing some of the Gentiles in Romans 1:30 that we read a moment ago, as being proud. So the word that he used was a Greek word, hybristes, and it means an insolent man, one who, uplifted with pride, either heaps insulting language upon others or does them some shameful act of wrong. So the word used is the idea of insolent, prideful. William Barclay wrote, "When hubris enters into a man's heart, that man forgets that he is a creature and that God is the creator." So that's another way to think about this idea of dethroning God. The idea of the king, also God as the creator. Our pride makes us forget we are the created, the creature. God is the creator. So pride can help us in our minds, in our hearts, to dethrone God. Pride causes us to exalt ourselves. Instead of God, we exalt ourselves. Since we were in Romans a moment ago, Romans 12, verse 3, then we're going to jump back to Proverbs. Romans 12 and verse 3. It says, "For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith." We shouldn't think overly high of ourselves. Now back to Proverbs 25, verse 27. Proverbs 25:27. Says, "It is not good to eat much honey, so to seek one's own glory is not glory." Seeking your own glory, it says, is not glory. And that goes back to what Chuck was saying a few minutes ago. All these things that we might be prideful in, they're temporary. They're passing. Whatever glory we might achieve in this world is going to be burned up. There's no glory to be had in this world that doesn't belong to God. So, putting ourselves on a pedestal, even in our own heart or in our own mind, that's sin. And that leads to destruction. Go back to that Chinese proverb we read earlier. If you're up on the pedestal, where are you going to step? Where's your next step to? All the way around is off. Pride also leads us to develop an attitude of superiority. And I used this phrase a minute ago, the idea of looking down your nose at somebody. I'm better than you. And there's so many different ways that in society people get this idea of how am I better than this person? And that list we read earlier, a lot of times that matches right up with it, that idea of appearance or education, race, social standing, job, things that you own. I'm better than you because of, one of these other things. But we know that's not accurate. So, this kind of attitude, so we call this being a snob, so snobbery. And I've used this hyphenated phrase here, out of natural order thinking. I'm using that term because God created all men and women, people. We're all the same. We're human beings. We're flawed human beings. We each have a soul. We each have an obligation to be obedient to God. None of these other things that we listed matters in any way. We're all in the same boat. We are all the created, the creature, and God is our creator. So if we think, I'm better than this person, that is out of the natural order. That's why I've used that phrase, out of the natural order. And so I've said here it's obnoxious to others. It's intolerable. Let's look at Proverbs 30, 21 through 23. Proverbs 30, 21 through 23. It says, "For 3 things the earth is perturbed. Yes, for 4 it cannot bear up. For a servant when he reigns, a fool when he is filled with food, a hateful woman when she is married, and a maidservant who succeeds her mistress." Let's look at that first one there, that servant reigns. We need to think of our relationship with God. If we have dethroned God, that's that servant who's trying to reign, right? We are the servants. So we see pride here. This attitude of superiority. The hateful woman when she's married, the maidservant who succeeds her mistress. Superiority. It said the earth is perturbed by this. It cannot bear it up. It's obnoxious. It's unacceptable. Snobbery. Attitude of superiority. It has no place among Christians. That's what it's telling us here. Pride leads us to become braggarts. We boast about things. We brag over things. We talk about ourselves and our own perceived merits. Let's turn over to Matthew again. Matthew 12, verse 34. Matthew 12, 34. And after that, we're going to 2 Timothy. Matthew 12, 34 says, "Brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." So being evil, how can we be speaking these good things? 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2 says, "For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy." And that pauses the list there. God doesn't like a braggart. What are we going to brag on? What are you going to say to God that's going to impress God? Nothing. There's nothing that we can accomplish on our own that God is going to say, "Oh, that's amazing. That's just fantastic." The only thing that God is going to look at is the way we respond to Him and obey His commands. If we want to impress God, be obedient to God. But there's nothing going to achieve. God's not going to look down and say, "Wow, man, that job you've got, that's really something." God created that world. God created the conditions for you to ever get that job. That's not going to impress God. God's not going to look down and say, "Wow, yeah, that diamond ring you're wearing is the best one I've ever seen." That's not going to impress God. The house you live in, God's not going to look at that and say, "Whoa, look at that." He can say, "Look at these mansions in heaven." What are we going to do to impress God? We impress ourselves, and we try to impress each other. But what are we going to brag on to God? The only hope we have is to brag from a proud spot, that good use of pride, that I did my best. I tried to be obedient to you. That's the only possible thing that we could ever hope to bring and brag before God. That's it. What else are we going to brag on? So pride leads us to do these 4 four things. We dethrone God in our hearts, we exalt ourselves, we develop an attitude of superiority or looking down on others, we become braggarts. We also, unfortunately, pride leads us to become self-willed. We begin thinking things like, my way is the best way. My way is the only way. My way or else. And folks, I can tell you, my way is rarely God's way. It's just not. I'm flawed. God is perfect. Not my way, His way. But how often do we end up putting our way first? So, thinking like this leads to the bell. We're done. All right, so next week we will talk about all the things being self-willed leads to.